Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video we are going to take a look at the 50 greatest classic books of all time, and I'm going to try and give you a very quick overview of what each book is about. See which ones you like, see which ones you disagree with. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? Just before we start, I do want to acknowledge that some will quibble that you cannot possibly make a list of 50 greatest classics. It's subjective and everyone will pick different things. I agree, but this list was compiled from examining 228 other lists, all of which had either an extensive number of people polled, or it came from lists that were collated by very respective critical appraisers of literature. So with that being said, let's start on our list. In 50th place is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, the great satirist of the 18th century. In this book, Lemuel Gulliver, a ship captain and surgeon, goes on a multitude of adventures and explorations from England, and he comes across lots of varied and wonderful islands full of wonderful and weird characters and people. The most famous being Lilliput, the island of small people where he's considered a giant. But you also have Baldibarbi, is a place where everyone's geared towards science and an obsessive pursuit of science. You have Laputa, the floating island. You have Lugnag, where you can talk to the ghosts of the famous dead. And through this story, what Swift manages to do is to analyse human interactions, human nature, society, the crazy going on of politics, and he observes various philosophies as well and tries to point the holes out in all of them. In 49th place is Alice Walker's The Colour Purple, a very harrowing and gruelling story but with an uplifting message. We have Celie, who is abused by her father, sexually abused and beaten. She starts writing letters to God to ask for help and explaining her feelings, and later she is married off to a farmer called Mr. That's all we're told. He also is very abusive towards her, but slowly, due to the influences of powerful women around her, one she respects, she begins to get a self-awareness, a self-development, and it's a growth to independence against all the obstacles that stand in the way of this young black girl. And topics of racism and sexism, of sexual abuse, of domestic violence, all are played out in this story. In 48th place is The Red and the Black by Stendhal. In this, we have our protagonist, Julien Sorel, who grows up in a provincial town of France, I think a son of a sawyer, and he dreams of becoming a great man, as people could do under the meritocracy of Napoleon. But Napoleon is no longer in charge, the monarchy is back, and society is becoming more rigid again, and movement upwards is very hard. However, Julien Sorel is determined to better himself. He has certain intellectual gifts and a great memory. We'll see escapades with him becoming more attractive to women of a higher rank than him, and we'll see him move up through his provincial life into the high society of Paris, where much is stacked against him because of his poor birth. We see the hypocrisy, the malignant eye of envy, the small-mindedness of the elite over those who don't come from a good background, and quite a surprising twist at the end. In 47th, we have The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. This book takes place in post-First World War Spain, Pamplona specifically, where our protagonist and some friends have gone out there to engage with the running of the bulls. This book has some of the most evocative and charming descriptions of Spain typical to Ernest Hemingway's writing ability. It explores ideas of the lost generation, that group of men who went into the battle of World War I, were decimated and then forgotten quickly afterwards. The disillusionment with life, the anger against life at the time, existential crisis of meaning, and the engaging in hedonism since nothing else seemed to have mattered, and all of the consequences that come with that. A very, very human book. In 46th, we have A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. Set in British-ruled India in the earlier part of the 20th century, we meet Dr. Aziz, a Muslim Indian, and also Miss Quested. They get to talking to one another. Eventually, they go on a journey where there is an accusation made by Miss Quested about or against Dr. Aziz. The ensuing trial brings to light the deepening fissures and clash between the native populace of India and the governing British. It highlights the problems of misunderstanding between cultures, not understanding each other's history, other people's outlook. And as is typical with Ian Forster, the British high class do not come off particularly well in this. It is a book of beauty, of unimaginably good description of scenes of India, but also of beautiful characters and interesting characters and moral dilemmas which the human race will never ever cease to be fighting with. In 45 is William Faulkner's Absalom Absalom. Thomas Sutpen moves into the town of Jefferson, Mississippi with a French architect in tow and a couple of slaves. He buys 100 acres with the plan that he is going to become a wealthy man and establish himself a family by marrying someone from the local aristocracy, the merchant class. The whole story is told in a sequence of flashbacks. It's told in a non-linear form and counts quite a sweep of time, including the Civil War in which Thomas Sutpen is embroiled. The idea behind this book that Faulkner really explores is part of what the curse of slavery was to the South of America, but also that the past can never be accurately interpreted. We always bring to it certain assumptions, certain surmises, often guesswork completely, and only a few smatterings of facts. And you will see this guesswork and surmise come through the various characters, notably Shreve and Quentin, who try and work out how things happened and why they happened that way. In 44th place is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This was not only semi-autobiographical of Dickens' life, it was the autobiography of almost an entire class of people. It was the dream that they all dreamed of living. So in our story, we find David Copperfield from birth all the way up through his growth, through hard times, to finally finding true happiness and contentment in his manhood. This book introduces us to a wide variety of some of the most famous and the most colourful characters in Dickensian London. Of course, there is his stepfather, Murdstone, the most brutal person, highlighting the difficulties of child abuse in that time. We also have Mr. Micawber with all his great errors that he makes, but a good soul. We have the Peggottys. We have his aunt Betsy, isn't it? And then you have the ever so humble but scheming Uriah Heep. This story was the story that the common person, the working class who inhabited the cramped alleyways, the dark streets, the smoke-filled air and the tight garreted buildings of London, they all read this hoping and believing that they too might have a chance of living the dream or the outcome of David Copperfield. In 43rd is Margaret Mitchell's epic Gone with the Wind, made famous in the Hollywood movie starring Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh. We are concerned with Scarlett O'Hara, the youngest of the three O'Hara girls, where the book starts or with a party about to take place, but this is shortly before the southern states secede from the Union, sparking the outbreak of the American Civil War. In this book, we're interested in how she has to adjust her attitudes, which are quite haughty and petulant, as the world around her changes, as the South begins to get crushed by the North in economic as well as warring conditions, and her attempts to keep the family plantation alive, and her awakening and growing as a human being, but also laced, or run through, I should say, with the feelings of unrequited love for a married man, and also a particularly roguish character who is really drawn to her, and she finds herself confusedly drawn to him. In 42nd is Jack Kerouac's On the Road. In this, you can't really have much of a more adventurous point in life than the late 40s and early 50s of North America. The war has ended. What is it like to be a youth in this? Our protagonist is a young man with his friend going on a sequence of road trips across the country through the United States as they look for adventure, as they seek to find freedom for themselves, to explore the ever-opening world that America brings up. It is, of course, the Beat Generation, the Jazz Age. So much is changing, and the standards are also changing as an after effect of the calamity that was the Second World War. This is a book that meant so much to a generation of young ones growing up in the 50s. In 41st place is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, written when she was 18 to 19 years old during a holiday with her husband Percy Shelley and their friend Lord Byron. They were asked to write a scary story, and Frankenstein was the result from Mary Shelley, an unreal accomplishment. In this story we find the young Dr. Frankenstein searching for the gift of giving life to things, and eventually he succeeds in bringing to life a creation of his own made from the bits and bobs of various bodies, and that is his creation. On its coming alive, Frankenstein panics and runs away. Now the creature, or the monster as it's called, is devoid of any direction, devoid of any love. We see its backstory and why it becomes so vehement in its pursuit of revenge against Dr. Frankenstein and all those around him. This is a fascinating Gothic tale which does question the rights or the limits of humans in their meddling with nature, and also the role of love and understanding of the other plays in a happy and working society. Have you read Frankenstein? If you're enjoying this video, but you're also interested in modern works of literature and contemporary works, you may be interested to know that I have another channel called Tristan Talks Books. I'll put the link down below, and there I'm forever on the hunt for some modern books that really cut the mustard, as it were. So if that sounds something you'd be interested in, be sure to check out the other channel. Right, back to the list. In 40th place is Mrs Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is a truly remarkable and small book at about 110 pages. We start the book with Mrs Dalloway setting up a soiree for her husband and his political friends that evening, but through the course of the single day we get various flashbacks and introductions to different characters. Mrs Dalloway comes across a former suitor, and she also comes across a shell-shocked veteran from World War I called Septimus Warren, who clearly is struggling to cope mentally after the effects of the war. This book is so insightful. If you have suffered with any mental health issues, you'll be surprised at how well some of this is captured in the inward stream of consciousness of Septimus Warren himself. You explore the nature of time, the meaning of life, trying to make sense of it all. And this is captured in, like I say, just 100 pages. In 39th place is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, a book that is getting increasingly popular of late. The book is hard to describe, but it's split into two parts, part containing the Master, the second part Margarita. They used to be lovers but had broken apart. Part one opens with Voland and Berlioz having an argument in which Voland prophesies Berlioz will die that night. He doesn't believe him, but lo and behold, the prophecy comes true. Satan enters Moscow with a bunch of his cronies, including the black cat which appears on all the front covers of these books, called Behemoth. They target and shine a light, a very harrowing critical light, on the intelligent elite of Moscow, showing them to be corrupt, to be shams, to be frauds and charlatans, and with no moral compass. The book continues to progress with another part focusing in sort of a flashback to the story of Jesus and Pontius Pilate talking with one another from the perspective of Matthew Levi the Apostle. Bulgakov uses this book apparently as an indictment of atheistic propaganda at the time that was going too far, that was saying that Jesus didn't even exist. He was also arguing very strongly against the idea that Russia was somehow becoming more noble, more moral than other nations around about, and was shining a very critical light. And by using this kind of magical, slightly absurdist take in his writing, this is how he brings it all to the fore, trying to show that the devil in some respects lies in all of us, and so does the idea of the Christ. In 38th place, we enter the discombobulating world of Franz Kafka. It is The Trial. In this book, our protagonist, Franz K., so Kafka himself, immediately enters a situation which grips our attention and our imagination. The police come to his apartment and tell him that he is accused of a crime and that he is under arrest. The problem is, not only has he not committed a crime, he doesn't know what the crime is meant to even be. However, despite being arrested, he's not taken to the prison and he's not taken straight into court. He just waits under the oppressive feeling of being summoned to trial, waiting to be called to trial, and it never seems to come. And so he goes on his way through the town trying to resolve the problem, trying to find more information. But everywhere he goes, it just gets more and more bizarre. We get from this the phrase Kafkaesque. It's like a living nightmare, and it is very much part of the surrealist movement. When you read this book, do not make the mistake of trying to read it philosophically and seriously. When Kafka himself read this book to his friends, he found it hilarious. And so you have to read it somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The thing that Kafka really points out in this book, though, is the horror and the oppressiveness of bureaucracy in a regime which is impenetrable to a person who doesn't know the ways and routes through the bureaucracy, and the fact that most of the bureaucratic offices do not know what each other are doing, leaving you in a complete tangle. The end of this book is very, very unusual, and you will not see it coming. In 37th place is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Would you believe this was meant to be a novella originally, but by the time he had finished writing it, it had the diameter of an oak tree trunk. In this book, we have Hans Castorp, and he goes and visits his cousin in Davos, so in the mountains of Switzerland. His cousin has tuberculosis and is in a sanatorium in the rarefied air of the Alps. Hans is only supposed to go for a short while, but he ends up stuck there for 7 years. And while he's there, the book recounts his interactions with various characters. This is something Mann had picked up when visiting his own wife in a sanatorium, where he said he found himself in an atmosphere of death and amusement. The characters all have different outlooks. You have a humanist from Italy. You have a Jesuit Jew who supports communism and totalitarianism. You have various others. And through these people, over the course of about 10 years, ending just at the outbreak of the First World War, Hans has a Bildungsroman, that is a journey of information, a journey of growth, mentally more than anything else. And this was a way to explore ideas skeptically of how to live, of the way that we are, of different forms of government, which just grew and grew until Thomas Mann had The Magic Mountain. So if you like books that are somewhat existential and explore philosophical themes, you may like to read this one. In 36th place is The Iliad by Homer, a book that has influenced so many other works of literature through thousands of years. We have the book, it starts around the end of the Greek-Trojan War. In fact, Agamemnon is king of the Achaeans, that is a conglomerate of the Greek states, and they are near Troy. Through this, we find a battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, and we come across some of the great figures of epic history, such as Agamemnon, King Priam, Paris, Hector, Diomedes, Menelaus, and of course, Achilles, the best of the Greeks, and his famous fury, the fury of Achilles. The book also relates the interworkings of the gods with the humans, the gods' petty squabbles amongst themselves on Mount Olympus, and how they each try to interfere in the activities of the Trojan War right at the end, and the great battles that ensue, and the wonderful poetic verse that this is written in. Now, when it comes to translation, I have this on high authority that although there are many good translations, the greatest, if you don't read Greek and want to read it in English, is still Alexander Pope's From Way Back When. Apparently that captures the proper hexameter, the rhythm of the poem, and also the use of syllables and sounds and alliteration to carry the meaning and the exalted state of the epic writing itself. So if you want to read the Iliad in its best form, and I intend to do this myself this year because I've read it before, but I don't think I had a great translation. Apparently Alexander Pope is difficult, but well worth it. Coming in at 35 is a book that has identity at the heart of its muse, specifically identity related to race, and it is Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. The Invisible Man, quite cleverly, is never named in the book. He is a young black American, and this book charts his journey for recognition, the struggles he has to go through because of his race, trying to establish an individuality, an identity, to be seen by the world, which is geared to overlooking him simply because of the colour of his skin. We see him in his travels through America, from south to north. We see him growing up, so a travel through age. We see him growing through political ideology in a determined quest to gain a voice, to be seen, to no longer be an invisible man. Coming in at number 34 could perhaps be one of the most loved novels on this list, and it is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Jane Eyre, a gothic romantic novel, but it's a subverted gothic. Charlotte Bronte plays with the tropes of the gothic in this book. We have the protagonist Jane Eyre. She is not loved as a child. She is ostracized because she is a stepdaughter. We see her go through the training school to become a governess, and how oppressive those places are and how there's little protection for the young. And then she goes to Thornfield, where Mr. Rochester lives. We have here the classic Byronic hero and the mysteries that take place at Thornfield, the growing or burgeoning desires within Jane Eyre, but how they come under repression, the showing that women have greater or equal or greater intelligence than many of the highest ranking and educated men. It also gives us a dilemma of conscience and of morality. What should love be built on? The whole book is an exquisite read, and if you haven't read it, I suggest that you do. Coming in at 33 is a book that used to be number 50 on this list, but this list is updated over time. The book is Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. Our protagonist is Salim Sinai, and he was born at the exact moment that India gained independence from Britain. He is one of a number of children who were born at that specific moment in India, and they share a somewhat spiritual, magical connection and have magical abilities. And we follow Salim's growth and connection to these ones through his life. But interestingly, the activities of his life seem to mimic activities that are happening to India itself, such as the division of Pakistan from India, the Bangladeshi War of Independence at the other side of India. In this book, Rushdie touches on themes which will always be at the core of great works. Themes of fate, which are forever through the classic. Themes of identity, as we've just mentioned in Invisible Man. Storytelling, the power of storytelling, of shaping a narrative to your life, of finding a sense of belonging amongst others. All the things that make us who we are. In 32nd place is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, an extraordinary work at a time when the the shape and form of the novel was being played with and experimented with. In To the Lighthouse, you have the Ramsay family who go to a holiday home, a home of theirs. And it's cut into 3 sections. The first section, you just see a day in the life of the Ramsays there. Through the minds, the stream of consciousness of various members of the family and what they're thinking. And the stream of consciousness, how it's not just one continuous thought, but the breaking of thoughts and fractured writing. This next section is the house itself in the absence of the family, when the family have gone away. And the third section is when the family returns 10 years later with a whole decade of new life experience and events that have happened amongst family members on their return. This is an exploration of the nature of time, the nature of the building of personality, the reshaping of thoughts, how experience impinges on our inward dialogue and how we perceive and react to others and environments that were familiar to us, but as they change through the movement of time. Another Charles Dickens comes onto the list in 31st, and it is Great Expectations. Here we have the story of a young lad called Pip making his way up to finding out what being a real gentleman is all about. Pip is apprenticed to being a blacksmith. He's quite content in their humble environment until one day he meets a girl who ridicules his rough hands because he's a labourer, and because of her beauty and he wants to impress her, he becomes ashamed of who he is and has aspirations to be a gentleman. Great Expectations. When he receives an inheritance of money from an anonymous donor, he suddenly changes the tack of his life and enters into London in an attempt to grow in society and gain his great expectations, becoming a gentleman of note. The characters he meets on the way, the lessons he learns from different people, all give an insight in what it truly means to be a really good person, a true gentleman, beyond the refinery of dress and manners. An absolute delight of a book, but it will challenge you in this one way. You are Pip in this book. And if you judge Pip harshly or positively, that says something about your own personality. Just to say, if you love classic literature or you want to get into it and desire to dig deeper to pull out some of the themes and ideas and motifs, consider coming over to my Patreon community. The link will be down below, where there's an ever-growing, engaged community of book lovers who every month we talk about one particular book as a read. You get exclusive content from me, and there is now a monthly meetup live for anyone that wants to attend. Also, check out the videos around my channel as well to get an idea of some of the stuff that you would find there. Anyway, back to our list. We're into the top 30 now, and in 30th place is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So in this book, you've probably read it, a lot of people, we have Huckleberry Finn who meets the runaway slave Jim, becomes his friend, and their adventure down the Mississippi, getting into all kinds of scrapes, meeting all kinds of unusual and colourful characters. What is the best way to shine a light on the hypocrisy and the failings of society around you, of the lies that adults tell themselves? Well, it's by using the eyes of an innocent child who assumes adults must be right, but can't quite figure out why, and their musings as to how they would do things, and their way of seeing others, like Huck's friend Jim, the way their friendship develops. And this story does tussle with the idea of friendship and of humanity and of growing up and of hypocrisy and of what is truly right and wrong, good and bad. It will also make you laugh a lot. Ernest Hemingway says, before Huckleberry Finn there was no American literature, and after Huckleberry Finn nothing else came. In 29th place is another book that is gaining more and more in popularity of late, and it is The Stranger, or The Outsider if you're in the UK, by Albert Camus. This book is an existential work. It's also a work of absurdism in which Camus explores societal norms and the conforming to them, even what to do when you don't conform emotionally to things, the correct emotional reaction to situations. Is there such a thing? The main character is a guy called Meursault, and at the beginning his mother dies, and straight after that he goes through a life of complete detachment. He's almost amoral, not invested emotionally in anything around him. You see him travel into Algiers, where he meets a woman that he's attracted to, and then he's asked by someone else to, perpetrate a crime. And then the ensuing trial is not so much about his guilt and what happens, as it is about this challenge to what is expected of a human, what is considered normal, what is the right emotional response to things and our interactions with others. Coming in at 28 is Beloved by Toni Morrison. In this book, which is set in the 1870s, we have our protagonist, a woman called Seth, a black woman, living at number 124 Bluestone Road with her eldest daughter, Denver, who is 18 years old. But the house is haunted and has been haunted for years. Seth's two younger boys both ran away when they were 13 because, arguably, of the ghost. The story will progress, and at some point, a friend from the old plantation comes to see Seth. His name is Paul D. And after a carnival, Seth returns home to find a young girl sat at the front of the house, and her name is Beloved. Seth is enchanted by her and wants to keep her around, but her friend warns against it. However, Seth keeps Beloved there, and so the story grows, and we eventually get a backstory that starts shining a light on the history of the characters. From this story, we get the exploration, as many say, of emotional, psychological, and physical scars through life, how we come to terms with them, and how they shape us and our future. Unsurprisingly, this book appears on this top 50 list, and it's in 27th place, and it is Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't really know what more I can say that hasn't already been said about this book. Not everyone loves it, but you appreciate loads of people do. It may be one of the best examples of world building ever. To create an entire runic language and poetry to put into this book to create the world is a feat of genius. And of course, the story, you've got Sauron, who's tried to make the one ring to rule them all. Each race, the dwarves, the humans, the elves, are given a ring, and so no one can have totalitarian power. You can see the hearkening to the war that had just taken place. But Sauron wants that ultimate power with one ring that rules them all, and so we have Frodo and all of his friends going off to Mount Doom to throw the ring into the fires and destroy it once and for all for the peace and well-being of everyone in Middle-earth. That's the book. Have you read it? Did you enjoy it? Which camp are you in? Love it or don't think it's that good? Nonetheless, it's loved by so many, it's in at number 27 on the greatest books. In at number 26 is an epic poem that has had a dramatic influence on literature and thought since the Renaissance period, and it is Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. Broken into 3 parts, we get the story of the journey of a soul to its creator. We start in Hell, which is Dante's Inferno. We get to Dante's Purgatorio, or Purgatory, the in-between, and then Dante's Paradiso, where the soul finally gets its reward for the virtuous acts through its life by coming to its creator. This is a book, obviously of its time and influenced strongly by the Catholic tradition, but it does explore the role of morality in the absolute, right and wrong, good and bad, the rewards for virtue, the punishment for sins, our human nature. There is also at play in this the argument or tussle between free will and determinism or predestination. Where do we fit on the scale? Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is that is an argument that is begun to raise its head again in philosophy and psychology. To what extent are we determined? To what extent do we have free will over ourselves? In 25th place is the great work of George Eliot's Middlemarch. This book is argued to be the closest work of English literature to a Tolstoyan story. It is a slice of life. It tracks the great interweaving interconnectedness of a multitude of lives that are closely lived in a village in 19th century Britain, and the expectations laid upon everybody, culture itself, societal norms, trying to navigate moral dilemmas, trying to navigate interpersonal relationships, and primarily, although not stuck with these two, but primarily through Dorothea Brooke, with her great idealism and the frustrations she comes up to when it comes to society's their attitudes compared to what she thinks should be right, and Tertius Lydgate, the young doctor, as well, as he tries to make a progressive way through a world that seems somewhat backward. This is slice of life. It is something that you read not quickly, but slowly. Chew it. Walk in the fields, walk down the streets, listen to the clink and tap of the hammer at the blacksmiths. Watch the cobbler working the leather of a shoe. Listen to the idle gossip and chit-chat of the women as they meet one another outside their houses. This is life, written in detail, with all of its joys and difficulties. In 24th place is arguably amongst or the most influential book in all of history, and it is the Bible. Of course, it's a collection of 66 smaller books written by 40 authors over the span of 1,600 years approximately, and it is said to deal with the separation of humans, their fall away from God, and that's why they die. And they've got a permanent damnation ahead of them, but God's intervening and leading his way to redemption and salvation and an eventual return to perfection for humankind. The book obviously is argued about and fought over. It's been used for terrible purposes. It's been used for good purposes. People today love it. Other people absolutely despise it. Some will hate the fact that it's even on this list. Some will hate the fact that it's not number one. What can be said about this book, whether you believe it or not, is that as a piece of literature, it has been extraordinarily influential. And if you want a real background in literature and you want to get the most allusions from literature possible, become familiar with the Bible. So many facets of the Bible have inspired literature, have inspired works of art, grand architecture, and are referred to endlessly in books and works. Just for instance, you have the scapegoat comes from the Bible. You have the four horsemen of the apocalypse comes from the Bible. You have the story of Adam and Eve. You have Noah's Ark. So many different allusions, which if you're just interested in literature, it's worth reading for that. As for its divinity, each person would have to read it and decide for themselves. Please, please, don't get into an argument with each other beneath this video. I will delete those comments. We are just listing a book on a list. In 23rd place is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, a great work of psychological and philosophical exploration and insight, following predominantly the three Karamazov brothers, Dmitri, Ivan and Alyosha. Fyodor Karamazov is supposedly going to meet up for an amorous tryst when he is brutally done in to death. The three brothers, then we explore their pondering over their personal guilt in it and their responsibility or complicity with that. But through it, Dostoevsky will explore various worldviews and various ideas, whether that's atheism versus faith, whether it's the pursuit of how much is it free will and the rules of mechanistic or deterministic values in our life. This book is a very powerful book, and if you want something that makes you think, read this. In 22nd place is the other epic poem by Homer, Odyssey. In this, we have the story of Odysseus and his return after the end of the war with Troy. He's trying to get back to his home island of Ithaca, but unfortunately he angers the god Poseidon, and so is this 10-year epic saga of him trying to return home. In the meantime, his son Telemachus is trying to ward off suitors who want to marry his mother because they all think Odysseus is dead. In this story, you meet the gods Athena, the protector of Odysseus himself. You will meet characters like the Sirens and the Scylla and the Charybdis. You get the story of the Trojan horse, amongst many other things. This work influenced lots of others. In fact, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf was a response to this work. Ulysses by James Joyce is trying to do this all in one day. So that was number 22, Odyssey by Homer. In 21st place is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, a very interesting book. It's the most famous of Conrad's works, and yet he didn't think too much of it. In the book, we have, Marley goes up the Congo River in search for an ivory trader called Kurtz. Kurtz seems to have gone rogue from the trading company and has now set himself up amongst the natives of the jungle, and he's almost revered as a god. Marlowe's job is to bring him back and sort everything out. As he goes on, though, we get the sense of the claustrophobia of the jungle. Everything takes place hemmed in on this one line of the river. In the book, Conrad seems to shine a light critically upon the colonial occupation of Africa by the Western powers. They do not come off well at all. There is also a very mysterious ambiguity about the way Conrad writes, which is why it's so readable. And yet it's very difficult to read as well. What does Kurtz mean when he says the horror, the horror? You will have to interpret it yourself. This book has sparked a lot of debate, some calling it racist, others actually using it as an argument for anti-slavery. Quite the opposite opinions of the same book. We're into the top 20 now, and in 20th place is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. This is a Southern Gothic book and highly respected for its contribution to the stream of consciousness way of writing. Some say this book captures the process of the human mind as it goes through thinking better than any other. The story itself deals with the disintegration of the Compson family after the Civil War. They're a Southern family, the Southern aristocracy, and the story is told from 4 different perspectives. You have Benji Compson, who is mentally inhibited, has struggles. He starts the story, then it moves to his older brother Quentin, then it moves to Jason Compson, and finally we get a third person narrative, but it's talking of Dilsey Gibson's life. She's the matriarch of the black servants that serve at the Compson's farm. The whole book describes a changing world, changing attitudes, how to adapt, and when your world is ripped to pieces. The title, The Sound of Fury, of course, comes from Macbeth's soliloquy when it talks about that life is but a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, the reference to idiot there is somewhat linked to Benji because of his mental problems. However, it's not supposedly derogatory because Benji's insights and his manner of perceiving what's happening around him in the confusion is, to me, the most evocative of all the writing, and it's from his account that everything else falls out. In 19th place is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, the father, really, of the realist movement in literature. In our story, we have Madame Bovary. She's married when she's young to a very kind but totally boring doctor who lives in a very small little town. And she wants excitement, she wants passion, she reads a lot of romance books, and this leads her to be very discontented with life, just the banal existence that most people go through compared to what she'd been reading. It leads her into some dreadful decisions. We get the topic of adultery come up here, which was shocking in its day, but it's depicted with so much realism, so much attention to the mundane, to the ordinary, that you can see how this book really became a turning point in literature, or contributed to a turning point in literature. In 18th place is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This book is a satirizing of the way that war is run, and the ends that men are pushed to in order to advance not only a war, but also the careers of their commanding officers. Our somewhat anti-hero, John Yossarian, is a bombardier on a B-52 bomber. And he starts off in the story in hospital trying to escape a bit of the fighting with a supposed liver complaint. The story develops not necessarily linearly, it develops as you go, with various characters being introduced. And a lot of the book makes you laugh at the circularity of people's opinions. There's logic in what people say, but when you step back, much of it doesn't make sense. Yossarian would say at one point, the enemy is the person who's going to get you killed. And that includes people either in the enemy's side or on your own side if they're sending you out to get killed. This book is one that a lot of people are not drawn to so much because they don't know what to expect. And yet when you read it, you will probably, like most, rank this as one of the best books you've ever read. In 17th place is the remarkable nonsense story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, beloved by adults and children for a long time. We know the story. Alice follows the white rabbit with a pocket watch, falls down a hole, then she ends up meeting a whole cast of strange and bizarre characters and a bizarre new world. The characters involve the Cheshire Cat, the Queen of Hearts, the Knave of Hearts. They play croquet with a flamingo. There's the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Not only is this a book a nonsense book and a high flight of imagination, but the writer, Lewis Carroll, or Charles Lutwidge Dodson, as his real name was a mathematician. And this book, beneath the surface, plays with the rules of logic, with the rules of mathematics and of time and what the structure of the universe. For instance, the Mad Hatter, for him, the time is always 6 o'clock because he tried to kill time and now he's being punished for it. And then you have the riddles that come up, which seem to be nonsense and a mockery of some of the philosophical discussions in the world. For instance, how is a raven like a desk? That's something that's asked at the tea party. If you haven't read this book, it's thoroughly enjoyable and no film has ever quite done it justice. It's a book I should review a bit more in depth in another video. Which of John Steinbeck's books would you say is better, East of Eden or The Grapes of Wrath? Well, in 16th place is The Grapes of Wrath, also known as America's novel. The book starts with Tom Joad, who's been incarcerated, released from prison. He goes back and meets his family who are in the prairies, but it's a time of economic depression and failed crops, and so they've sold everything up and are headed out down Route 66 to California to start a new life. On the way, they're going to meet many other migrants who pack the route because they also are suffering great economic hardships. This is a tale, A Plight of the Poor by Steinbeck. He was accused of being communist for it, even though it wasn't a communist work. Various ideas are considered in this, such as the inhumanity of humans to each other, the role that righteous indignation can play in a character, and there are questions as people move along and the family begins to dwindle along the way. Will the promised land of California really live up to expectations? Have they really made the right decisions? This is a full-on... Yeah, it's a great backdrop of 1930s America in the typically vivid Steinbeck writing, one of my favourite writers. In 15th place is Tolstoy's magnum opus, War and Peace. This great book charts the course of 5 aristocratic Russian families against the backdrop of the Napoleon era. Russia is involved with the coalition in fighting against Napoleon's spread across Europe, but while that's going on, we see the tales of love, we see the exploration of individuality and the meaning of life, we see the impact of war upon society, national identity. This book almost effortlessly swings between battlefield and drawing room, between army camp and street scene, between melee and casual conversation over a game of whist. The whole book is just remarkable, full of too many characters to even mention, but it is the biggest slice of life, as others have said about Tolstoy, that you are ever going to put on your plate and enjoy. In 14th place is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, the great Gothic novel that got completely out of control. It even ran away from Emily Bronte to a degree. This book is a book so charged with passion and force and drive. It's a shout in the wilderness of the Yorkshire moors. The book discusses the obsessional passion, the all-consuming passion between Cathy Earnshaw and Heathcliff, and how it wreaks havoc not only on their own souls, but on everyone around them. There is a tale of revenge, of bitterness, of anger in all of this. And yet we're mesmerised by the great Byronic hero Heathcliff. Despite his awful will, you're still attracted to his sheer magnetism of character. What is Emily trying to say in this book? Recently on my Patreon community, we spent 2.5 hours live talking about this. It is an extraordinary book of nuclear force, but be warned, it can be quite grueling to go through, and yet you can't turn away. You have to see what happens. In 13th place is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Such a simple and straightforward story. It's also a moral story which shines a light on the ludicrousness of racism and judging people by the colour of their skin and the need for changes in attitude. So in this book, our main character is Scout and her brother Jem. They're the kids of Atticus Finch, the lawyer, which most of us know the name of now. And their father has taken up a court case for a black man who is accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. It highlights the ignorant ideas that adults have, grown people have about another race because they're different. And this is set off so cleverly by the character who lives next door to Jem and Scout, who they never see and have made up like a bogeyman image of them and are frightened of them. But really, all it is they don't know them. This book, if you've never read it, is so worth the read. It's a simple tale told beautifully, and in the end, isn't that what most literature should be about? In at number 12 is another book by Leo Tolstoy, and it is the great love story of Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina, this wonderful, beautiful, intelligent woman in Moscow society, meets Count Vronsky. Even though she's married, an adulterous liaison begins to take root. This will eventually cause a dramatic change in affairs socially and a horrible demise, and one of the best endings to a book you will ever read. But simultaneously to Anna's story, there is also the story of the noble Levin. His focus is in the countryside as opposed to the drawing rooms and high society of city life, and he is exploring purpose, meaning of life, and what is genuine happiness. And although they're living different lives, the juxtaposition of those two ways of living and how to get happiness and satisfaction really give the reader pause for thought if they take the time to do it. In 11th place is the great American novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville, the story that focuses in on the complete obsession of Captain Ahab as he tries to hunt in the cold waters of the ocean the white whale Moby Dick and to kill it. But the story is told from our narrator Ishmael, the famous opening line, "Call me Ishmael." There are great characters including Starbuck and Queequeg, but Ishmael goes on board the Pequod to the whaling vessel, and so begins an extended journey which is so claustrophobic despite being in vast open spaces. We have the narrow monomania obsession, the narrow focus in a vast space of possibilities. This book is so unique in the way it takes on the human condition, but what I specifically love about it, despite some very grueling bits to do with whale anatomy, is the beauty of the language. Sometimes I will open Moby Dick at a random page and just read anything because Melville's use of words is just delightful. But be prepared to take this book slowly. If you try and speed read it, its words will probably choke you. We are now into the top 10 of the 50 greatest classic books. This one, unsurprisingly, is in the top 10, and it's Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This is a book that some people say gives you an insight into the psychology of what happens if you commit a crime. This book is way, way more than that. Raskolnikov has an idea that some people are built in such a way that they can go beyond the restrictions of society, that they are able to break the rules for the benefit of other people. He uses Napoleon as an example, sacrificed many men's lives in order to build a greater France. Raskolnikov himself knows that there is a miserly pawnbroker, an old lady who is vicious and nasty, and she seems to acquire everyone else's wealth, and he thinks, would it be wrong to kill her if all of that money was then given to people who are nice and would benefit from it? Can someone rightly and morally overstep the bounds of society? Is there such a thing as actual true morality? The whole book follows the fallout of the committing of a crime right early on by Raskolnikov, and the investigation of the police officer trying to hunt down the character, and his interest with Raskolnikov gives a great psychological pressure for the reader to engage in. The way this book ends is one of the most perfect endings to me, and then he put an epilogue on, and some people love it, some people don't like the epilogue. I wonder which one you would be. In ninth place is a book that might surprise you. It's Don Quixote by Cervantes. It may surprise you that it's not in first, as it is in first in many lists. So Don Quixote is the errant knight, isn't he? He's the old Spaniard nobleman who has read so many historical romances of medieval troubadours and knights, fighting for the love of a woman they can never attain, that he decides to become a knight-errant himself. And he goes on great quests across Spain on his horse Rocinante, a clapped-out nag, performing deeds for a woman called Dulcinea, who she doesn't even know who he is and doesn't even know that he loves her. It's farcical what he gets into. He goes along with Sancho Panza as his sidekick. And the story is just beautiful. It's effortlessly fluid. It is a great story, not just having meaning. Yes, it points out the folly of building high ideals based on romanticism, which is what Cervantes was mocking. But it's a series of escapades, one after another, which make you smile, which make you laugh, and you realise, actually, not much has changed in us over all these centuries. In eighth place is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This book is beloved by millions and at the same time is quite harshly reviewed by some because it seems so light and frothy and simple. The truth is, this book has so many more layers than meet the eye. Jane Austen introduced a style of satirical observation which dramatically shifted the way other writers started approaching their works. She was really the big strength behind the use of free indirect speech, which is so par for the course in writing now. But her insights and her critique of society are so lightly placed that the books feel real, and yet there's such a sharpness of wit sitting beneath. If I were to relate Austen to a classical composer, it would be Mozart. A lot of his symphonies and works sound light and surface in the way they run, but there is a great deal going on beneath if you just tune your ear in, and then it becomes a veritable symphony in words when you read Pride and Prejudice. In seventh place is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This tracks the destructive life of Humbert Humbert, an older man who is attracted to what he terms nymphets, which is adolescent or pubescent children, sort of 12 to 14 years of age. And it's his attraction to a particular young girl of 12 called Lolita and how he manipulates events to be around her. We get the internal dialogue of himself and his feelings about this. This is not a book I imagine lots of people would want to read. Others who have read it do praise the style of writing, but warn that you need to keep your distance from entering into the mind of Humbert Humbert. So that's number 7, Lolita. In sixth place is the remarkably prescient dystopian novel 1984 by George Orwell. We have Winston Smith from Victoria Mansions. He's a low-level worker in the government, and he begins to start questioning the things that government have been telling everybody. The government, of course, is Big Brother, with the famous phrase, Big Brother is watching you. You have the Ministry of Truth, which manipulates all information that people are to consume so that they agree with the consensus narrative of the time. Winston will start going down the rabbit hole, as it were, into doubting the government and its intentions, and then it leads him to meet other people, an underground resistance, and then ultimately the infamous Room 101. This book is the book that most people say they've read when they haven't. That's actually been studied. You should read this book and then ask yourself the question after reading it: do I believe what is given me? Most people say they don't, but actually most people in arguments default to the consensus opinion and use that as an argument. This book would be a strong warning against any inclination to say the consensus says, especially if the consensus is in any way, shape or form tied to governmental influence. We are now at the big five of the list. In fifth place is J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. Now, this book has been enjoyed and read by an endless stream of pilgrims who are adolescents on the journey to adulthood. The story follows Holden Caulfield. He's been expelled from Pensy School for boys, and the story takes place over a long weekend. He doesn't want to return home, so he heads into New York. And it's right here that he gets the sense of a changing world, of going into the world of adulthood, and the changing person he is inside. He'll come up against violence. He'll come up against understanding the lies that adults tell themselves and each other, the burgeoning desires of sexuality and of the dreams that one has for the future, and the realization that life is hard. There's so much in this book, but it's captured in a small number of pages, and it's been a staple of many high schools for a long time because it's a book many teenagers relate to, and most adults looking back still relate to really strongly. They remember every knot and feeling that Holden feels for himself. In fourth place is a work that's been called by many the greatest work of literature ever written, and it is Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, specifically the first volume, which is The Way of the Swan or Swan's Way. In this book, Proust, does he tell a story as much as a complete nostalgic reflection on life as a whole? Just life as we live it. This is a book about love, about misery, about heartbreak, about desire, about literature, about time, about meaning, about art, about music, about everything that makes a human being. A multitude of large and infinitesimal engagements with the world around us, and how these burn into our memories and affect the way we view life and place a colour on it. Of course, the most famous scene being that moment when he tastes the buttery Madeleine cake, and it takes him right back to a moment of pure nostalgia. And that's the book. One of its great facets is that it's beautifully written. It's almost liquid poetry. And I can only imagine, it's a bit hard, I found, in English at times. It's not a simple story read. You take it in increments, you imbibe it rather than scoff it down. But I wonder just how marvellous it must be in the original French. In third place is F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby. This story is told by the rather bland narrator Nick Carraway, which is actually a genius character to narrate this book, because he places the perfect canvas on which to paint the very exotic characters he comes across, notably Jay Gatsby and Daisy Buchanan. Jay Gatsby loves Daisy, but Daisy is married to Tom. Gatsby wants to win her. He has made himself into a millionaire, for argument's sake. He throws these great grand parties that everyone wants to attend. This is the roaring 20s of America. This is America beginning to grow into the economic giant that it will become. The thing about this book, though, some say it's a description of the American dream and maybe the danger of a dying morality being replaced by materialism. But that's only a part of this book. Even though it's 120 pages long only, This book has a lot to do with romantic idealism, holding on to a past dream and not being able to move on, to change one's ideas, perceptions, hopes and dreams. This book has one of my favourite paragraphs in all of literature in it, and that paragraph comes on the very, very last page. And the green light may forever stick with you in memory if you've read this book. In second place is a book that might surprise you as well for not being in first place, and it is the novel that broke the novel, Ulysses by James Joyce. In this we have the character of Leopold Bloom, which even today they celebrate in Ireland as Bloomsday, and also Stephen Dedalus. This is a book which navigates a single day, and yet it takes like 1,000 pages to get through, where Bloom and Dedalus pass through the town of Dublin, interacting with people, crisscrossing each other's lives without actually touching until they finally do meet. But it's the way that the story is told, the stream of consciousness, the regularly interrupted bullet rat-a-tat change of thought that our mind goes through when we're speaking, the use of headlines as well, the use of poetry and songs and verse, which all crop up through the book in different ways, the playing with language constantly. It's a book of its time. It's still appreciated by writers today, not just for the story, but for what it was trying to do with language. For that reason, many people hate it. Other people think it's an inspired work of genius. And if you want to read something as a story, as a straightforward novel, don't go near this book, because that's not how it works. But if you want to see what experimenting with a story is, if you want to try and engage with a story that makes you think the way the mind thinks, a bit like The Sound and Fury, the way it's told there with William Faulkner, then this is a work that you might want to read. It's also a book you may want to read just 10 pages at a time around another book. Because like I say, if it's story you're after, this one's quite difficult, and yet it has some of the greatest turns of phrase that you'll come across. If you keep a quote book, you'll get many from Ulysses by James Joyce. So we have gone through 49 great works that have been compiled from 228 book lists, and now we are at the number one in the greatest 50 books. And it is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This book was written in 1967, and it's one of those few books which are credited with changing the course of literature, of having a dramatic influence on the way stories are told. It's a book of magical realism. In it, we have the setting up of a small village in South America. Macondo is the name of the village. And into the village move the Buendia family. The story will then chart 7 generations of the Buendias, taking on all sorts of changes through life and time, and their reactions to it, both good and bad, including warfare, including inner turmoil, including crime, everything you can imagine. But into Macondo regularly come a band of gypsies. And they reveal things about the outside world, scientific discoveries, the magnet. There's a bit about ice when one of the members of the family remembers when his father showed him ice for the first time. But they hand them a manuscript, and this manuscript remains in the family all these generations, and yet no one realizes that in it is a secret terribly linked to the family themselves. But only one of them ever discovers what the secret is. The way this book ends is not unique. It is not a new device, a new idea. It's an idea that's been thought of many, many times. But how well is this idea executed in this book? And ask yourself when you read it, how well does this idea fit as an ending to the whole tenor and tone of this book? I hope you've enjoyed this quick fly through the 50 greatest books written. I know that there's no such thing as 50 greatest books, it's subjective. So tell me, which book wouldn't you have on this list, and which book would you replace it with, which is not here. Also, if you love classic literature and you want to dive deeper into it, please look at my other videos on book reviews or consider joining my Patreon, where we have a growing community which is getting very interactive now, and each month we take a classic and we pull it apart. In fact, just last month we did number 14 on this list, which was Wuthering Heights, and what a discussion we ended up having around that. I'll leave a link below if you want to join it, and until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.